All right, well, thank you very much, Adnan, for that presentation. It is going to be interesting because I have the Sa'ana manuscripts in my presentation as well, and I'll be wondering if there's any loud takbirs at the end when you discover that the actual original writings of Sa'ana are different than what you have now. That'll be interesting to look at. Now, the key to this second debate is to apply the same standards here that we should have been using in the examining of the New Testament. Was the transmission of the Quran a free transmission or a controlled transmission? I think we have already actually come to the conclusion on that. We recognize that it is a controlled transmission. Now, a quote for you from Matsar Qadsi. He says, Muslims and non-Muslims both agree that no change has ever occurred in the text of the Quran. The above prophecy for the eternal preservation and purity of the Quran came true not only for the text of the Quran, but also for the most minute details of its punctuation marks as well. It is a miracle of the Quran that no change has occurred in a single word, a single letter of the alphabet, a single punctuation mark, or a single diacritical mark in the text of the Quran during the last 14 centuries. That's the claim that I think a lot of Muslims here tonight believe. But at this point, there is truly no question, as scholarly sources, Islamic and non-Islamic, both attest to the exact same story. And there's a massive difference between what Islamic scholars say and what many Muslims believe on this particular matter. For example, in 2007, there was a publication, the Top Copy manuscript. I have a copy of this publication, and here you have one of the charts that is produced. There are 3 pages of these charts showing the variant readings between major manuscripts of the Quran. This is an Islamic produce. This is from Muslim scholars in Turkey showing the variations in these mushaf in regards to the text of the Quran. I didn't produce this, they did. And there's 3 pages of them. You can look at that for yourself. But I need to show these to you. I want to get to the real issue, which is the means of transmission. But the fact that there are textual variants has to be recognized. Because what you just did, I could put P66 up on the screen. Maybe I'll do this in my rebuttal period. I could put P66 up on the screen and read it to you in Greek, and it'll be exactly what's up there too. That doesn't prove much. The question is what's in that manuscript what was originally written by the author? That's the issue we need to be dealing with tonight, not anything else. Okay? So let's try to keep the emotions to themselves. Look at Surah 3:158. Here is a variant that's found in Surah 3:158. Let's sort of blow it up here so you can see it. Here's the text under consideration, which speaks of Allah surely gathering those who die to himself. Here is the same text from Quranic manuscript 328, which is found in the National Library of France in Paris. It is dated to around 100 years after Hijrah. But as reading Hijazi text is hard even for those who read modern Arabic, let's expand the text out a little bit so you can see it. Now, what you can see is that the Paris manuscript has an extra aleph, not found in the modern printed Quranic text. But in this case, that extra aleph completely changes the meaning. In the ancient text, it says those who die will not be gathered to Allah, while the modern 1924 printed text, which I would imagine most Muslims in the audience have, says that they will surely be gathered to Allah. Now, please, make sure you understand why I point this out. I'm not saying we can't figure out the original wording, but I am pointing out how important it is to have a full, unedited, widely dispersed manuscript tradition with which to make such determinations. That is very, very important. Likewise, Surah 2, 222. You were just looking at Surah 2, 265. All right. Surah 2, 222. Let's look at it in the Fogg's palimpsest manuscript and also bring in the Sa'ana manuscripts as well. Surah 2, 222 provides another example, this time based upon Fogg's palimpsest manuscript. A palimpsest is a manuscript where the original writing has been washed off in another version or completely different work written on the washed leather. Using ultraviolet light, we can often read the original writing. When we read the original text in the Fogg's manuscript of Surah 2, 222, which I have here on the top, and compare the current edition, we see not just variation, we see wholesale editing. Words are changed, the word order is changed, verbal forms are altered, grammatical terminations are changed, etc. This is clear evidence of the continued attempt, at least a century after Uthman, of ridding the Quran of the readings of Ibn Masud. But even more vital is the fact that a palimpsest portion of the Sa'ana manuscripts, which have been radiocarbon dated, as Adnan was pointing out, to have a better than 50% chance of being pre-Uthmanic in date, contain a third reading of this text, which is different from both the Fogs and the Uthmanic readings. Now, this is evidence of text types, just as we will see both Bukhari and Al-Kindi record for us as we look through their texts. So here we have evidence in the palimpsest of preceding text types even before the Uthmanic text that exists that you were just reading and saying, see, nothing has changed. Well, how did that text get on there before there that was different? There was a redaction. There was an editing. And I want to know what was originally given, not what somebody else thought should have been given. And that's why the free transmission of the text is so superior to any controlled transmission of the text. Now, let's look at what Sahih al-Bukhari says about where the Quran came from. This is the earliest sources we have, many of the sources. You have to have two manuscripts, and they had to be, those are later traditions. Oh, you can talk all about isnad chains you want. Every single hadith that Bukhari and Imam rejected had an isnad chain. There were thousands of them. No one that I know of, and nobody that Adnan quotes in regards to history that he was using against the New Testament would ever accept the idea of isnad chains as the standard of historical research. They would never accept it. Again, we need to use the same standards. Now, you know the text, Sahih al-Bukhari 6, 509 and 510. Narrated Zayd bin Thabit, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq sent for me when the people of Yamama had been killed, that is, a number of the Prophet's companions who fought against Musaylima. Abu Bakr then said to me, Umar has come to me and said, casualties were heavy among the Qurra of the Quran, that is, those who knew the Quran by heart, on the day of the Battle of Yamama, and I am afraid that more heavy casualties may take place among the Qurra on other battlefields whereby a large part, kathir, large part of the Quran may be lost. This has nothing to do with pronunciation. Why in the world would these people be afraid that a large part of the Quran is going to be lost? And actually, we have the entire thing written down. We even actually have all the verses, all the ayahs and everything. It's all been written down. We've got all this, but it's the pronunciation we're worried about. That is not a meaningful reading of the original, and there are many Islamic scholars that would agree with that. That's not a meaningful reading of the original. There was a concern that the Quran would be lost because the Quran was not yet written down. That's why there was a concern. Therefore, I suggest you, Abu Bakr, order the Quran be collected. I said to Umar, how can you do something which Allah's apostle did not do? Umar said, by Allah, it is a good project. Umar kept on urging me to accept his proposal until Allah opened my chest for it, and I began to realize the good in the idea which Umar had realized. Okay? So, he says, I started looking for the Quran and collecting it from what was written on palm stalks. Why didn't he just go and get the original that was already there with all the ayahs and everything all there? No, he goes looking for the Quran and collecting it from what was written on palm stalks, thin white stones, doesn't sound like a mushaf to me, and also from the men who knew it by heart. Oh, so all of it wasn't written down, till I found the last verse of Surah At-Tawbah, repentance, with Abi Kuzami al-Ansari, and I did not find it with anybody other than him. One person knew this text. One. What about those 70 others that died at Yamama? Did any of them know some that nobody knew? It's a question that has to be asked. It can't just be swept under the rug. It has to be asked. And we're going to find out in the next hadith that even at this point, this is right at the days of Abu Bakr, this is right after the death of Muhammad, 18 years later or so, 15 to 18 years later, they're going to find another verse that they didn't find the first time around. And this is your own hadith sources. I'm just quoting what it says. The verse that they found with one person was, verily there has come unto you an apostle Muhammad from amongst yourselves. It grieves him that you should receive any injury or difficulty till the end of Surah Al-Tawbah. So there you have the last one found with one person. Then the complete manuscripts, copy of the Quran, remained with Abu Bakr till he died, then with Umar till the end of his life, and then with Hafsa, the daughter of Umar. So there's the first collation of Abu Bakr. Next hadith. Hudayfa bin al-Yaman came to Uthman. Hudayfa was afraid of the people of Sham and Iraq's differences in the recitation of the Quran. Not just the pronunciation, how they were reciting it. There were differences. Why would that cause anybody a problem? Well, because they didn't have a fixed manuscript yet. And so they come traveling back and they say, Uthman, O chief of the believers, listen to what's said here. Save this nation before they differ about the book, the Quran, as the Jews and Christians did before. Oh, so we don't want to have any differences. We don't want to have any argumentation. So we need one fixed version. There's a problem here. So we need to have one fixed version. So Uthman sent a message to Hafsa saying, send us the manuscripts of the Quran so we may compile the Quranic materials in perfect copies and return the manuscripts to you. So Hafsa sent it to Uthman. Now, let me just ask you a question. If all they did was take what was from the days of Abu Bakr and reproduce it, this shouldn't have taken much difficulty at all. There shouldn't have been any more collation. They shouldn't be looking for new ayahs. But that's not what happens. In fact, Uthman then ordered Zayd bin Thabit, then you have the entire committee here, to rewrite the manuscripts in perfect copies. And why would Uthman say to the three Qurayshi men, in case you disagree with Zayd bin Thabit on any point in the Quran, then write it in the dialect of Quraysh. The Quran was revealed in their language. Wait a minute, I thought you were just recopying what you already had. Why would you be worried about something like this? Didn't you do this back at the original collation? Sounds like something more is going on here. And it actually indicates very clearly they did so. And when they had written many copies, Uthman returned the original manuscripts to Hafsa. Uthman sent to every Muslim province one copy of what they had copied and ordered that all the other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burnt. That is a redaction. That is an editing. And that stops the level of certainty you can have in a transmitted text at that point, if he was in fact successful and destroyed everything that came before. I don't think he was, but we know that he couldn't have been because Ibn Masud wouldn't give up his manuscript. That's why we have evidence of Ibn Masud's readings. But if he had been successful, that's as far as you could trace the text of the Quran back, and you just simply have to believe Uthman and his committee got it perfectly right. Was Uthman a prophet? Was Zayd bin Thabit a prophet? Were they sinners? I can understand if you said that Muhammad did this and he has inspiration. This is coming a lot longer. And folks, if you know your history, you know that right now there is tremendous tension in the Islamic Ummah between Umar and Ali that's going to result in what? The very same tensions you have today. You know that's what was going on back then. And don't you think that would have an impact on what Uthman does with the Quran and the compilation of the Quran? I think you really know that. Zayd bin Thabit added, oh, by the way, a verse from Surat Azab was missed by me. When we copied the Quran, I used to hear Allah's apostle reciting it, so we searched for it, and guess what? We found it with Kazimi bin Thabit al-Ansari, and the verse was, among the believers are men who have been true to their covenant with Allah in Surah 33. So that ayah had just been left out in the cold for about 18 years. And now it is put in. How many ayah were lost at the Battle of Yamama? This text raises the question. The result was that in the caliphate, now here, let me switch over. Sorry, I skipped too quickly here. We can demonstrate that the traditions that Bukhari gives us were well known even outside the Islamic community. One of the earliest writers against Islam as a Christian was named Al-Kindi. And around the time of 820 AD or so, he has an exchange, a written exchange with a Muslim. And the result is one of the most insightful encounters that we have. It's extremely important for us to look at this kind of information. Here's what he writes to his Islamic friend on this subject, and notice the parallels to Bukhari. The result was that in the caliphate of Uthman, it was discovered there was no consensus to the true text. One man then read one version of the Quran, his neighbor another, and they differed. One man said to his neighbor, my text is better than yours, while his neighbor defended his own. So additions and losses came about, and falsification of the text. Uthman was told that various versions were in use, that the text was being tampered with, and that strife with all the mischief of party spirit was being engendered. They said, we do not believe that matters can continue as they are. It is an affair of urgency. They are slaying one another. The sacred book is corrupted. A second apostasy is imminent. So there is great concern, just as Bukhari says, great concern that we don't want to be like the Jews and the Christians. And so this is in the time of Uthman. Now, Ubay, the son of Ka'b, was dead before it was made, while Ibn Masud refused to give up his copy of the Quran. Now remember, what did Muhammad say in the Hadith? If you want to know the Quran, he pointed to 4 people. What was one of them? Ibn Masud. Zayd bin Thabit was not one of them. And so I can imagine, if you've ever read any of the hadith that come from Ibn Masud, this guy, he was a man's man, you know what I mean? I mean, this guy, he had a backbone. And I don't think he appreciated being left out of the compilation of the Quran. Because Muhammad himself had said, this guy knows the Quran. And he was left out of it. So can you imagine when Uthman comes along, Muhammad hadn't said Uthman was the best, and Uthman comes along and says, give me your manuscript, I'm going to destroy it. Abdullah ibn Masud says, I don't think so. And in fact, because of that, his readings continue in the manuscript tradition for hundreds of years, especially in the palimpsest manuscripts. So they drove him from his post in Kufa and appointed Abu Musa as governor in his place. In fact, some historical sources say he was beaten because he would not give up his mushaf. There's differences about that particular issue. When the revision had been completed according to the various manuscripts, 4 copies were made in large text, one of which was sent to Mecca, a second remained in Medina, a third was sent to Syria and is today in Malatya. In fact, Al-Kindi goes through a whole story of what happened to each one. It's amazing the type of information that he had about this particular situation. When the next Uthman gave directions, the leaves and sheets of the Quran should be gathered in from the provinces. He ordered his agents to collect all that they could lay their hands on and destroy them till it should be certain that not a sheet remained in the possession of any private individual. That is the very definition of a controlled transmission. That's like the government come along and saying, we now have the official version of the Bible, give us all yours. You can trust us. Sorry, I don't see Abdullah ibn Masud doing that. There are hadith where he tells the people of Kufa, don't give up your mushaf. There were divisions, there were differences. If it was all the same Quran with no differences, why are there these divisions? Interesting question. Heavy penalties were threatened against the disobedient. All the leaves they could secure were shredded and boiled in vinegar till they were sodden. Nothing remained, not even the smallest fragment that could be deciphered. That is the Uthmanic revision. And that is a tremendous disruption in the transmission of the Quran, and by the very standards that Adnan used, it makes the Quran corrupt and untrustworthy. Now, I don't say that. I'm not making that because I don't use that kind of radical, unsubstantiatable standard. I don't know any scholar that does. But that's what we had being used from the New Testament. And so I'm just apply the same thing, make sure that we're being fair. Then he finally says to his Muslim friend, you know what happened between Ali, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman? How they hated each other and quarreled and corrupted the text? How each one tried to oppose his neighbor and to refute what he had said? Pray, how are we to know which is the true text, and how shall we distinguish it from the false one? And there's the question. Why is Ibn Masud wrong? Why are his readings? I mean, scholarly sources will tell you, for example, that in the tafsir of Safyan very early on, 67 places he mentions a difference in the razm, the actual reading of the text, and attributes them to Ibn Masud. And his is a fairly short tafsir. At that early period of time, they didn't have any problem talking about the fact that there were variations between Ibn Masud. Ubay ibn Ka'b's was primarily the same as Ibn Masud's, but there's some differences there. And now we have the Sa'ana palimpsests, which you just had up on the screen during your presentation, which gives us another reading outside of Abdullah ibn Masud. So we have textual variation. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Which methodology gives us the most certainty as to the real question? Do we possess the original words of the authors we believe to have been inspired of God? Now you can sit here and say, yes, because we have isnad chains, and if that's good enough for you, I wasted my time for you. Okay? I'm only here for people who really want to know the truth, and you're not going to be satisfied with the answers you already brought in here. Okay? I realize that cuts off some folks, but that's the only way I know how to handle the truth. I can't convince you. I'm not going to try to. But for people who have truth in their hearts and desire to be truthful, The question is, which methodology gives us the most certainty as to the real question? Do we possess the original words of the authors we believe to have been inspired of God? The free transmission of the New Testament text precludes the editing and revision that we just saw. The manuscript tradition shows us tenacity. The original readings still exist. No one could insert the deity of Christ into the text of the New Testament, take out some other doctrine, put some denial of the resurrection or something. They could not do that. The transmission of the text could never allow that to happen. And it's because it was freely transmitted, widely transmitted from the very beginning. But the controlled transmission of the Quran, together with the Uthmanic revision, the possible later work of Abd al-Malik, which I haven't even gotten to this evening, and the evidence of the differing traditions of Ibn Masud, Ubay ibn Ka'b, and possibly others, the Sa'ana readings that we saw, raises serious questions as to the originality of the Uthmanic tradition. At the very least, what I've proven to you is that you have multiple traditions. You've got Uthman, you've got Ibn Masud, and you've got this other reading in Sa'ana, and you've got Ubay ibn Ka'b. You say, well, I like the one. Great, fine. Why? How do you know? What methodology have you used? And it's not chains aren't going to cut that for you, by the way. What methodology does your system provide you to know that that actually represents the original? That is the question for all of us this evening. Islamic scholars and apologists must recognize that merely asserting the perfection of the Uthmanic tradition proves nothing. The realities of the variant traditions must be embraced and examined before the Quran can be proven to have been accurately transmitted. What you need, my friends, is a critical edition of the Quran. Now, for many of you sitting here, you look at our Bibles, and you look at those footnotes, or you look at the UBS 4th edition over there, and he holds it up and says, see all this stuff? These are the variations. And I go, thank God I have that. Because that means no one has been able to get in there and totally change this and fool me. I want that information, and we're wide open about it. Where is your critical Quran? I'm not talking about the 7 Aruf. I'm not talking about that. Where is your critical Quran? Now, there's a project right now called the Corpus Quranicum, but it's primarily Western scholars that are working on it. And there are a lot of people in the Muslim world, they don't support doing that. We don't need to have a critical edition of the Quran. We don't need to be telling people there was a variation at Surah 2, 222. I want to know that. I want to know what John wrote, and I want to know what Mark wrote, and I want to know what the original authors wrote, not what somebody wrote 100 years or 15 years or 500 years later, or what they thought should have been written. I want to know the original. And so what I'm saying to you is, the reason for the debate this evening is to try to bring the facts to light and call for the even scales. If you embrace radical skepticism in regards to the New Testament, you have no reason to believe in the Quran. Adnan wasn't using the same scholarship there. There wasn't one of those scholars that he was quoting that would believe a word he was just saying about, well, you know, we've got these traditions and they didn't write anything down unless they had 2 copies and all the rest of this stuff. Every single person who, for example, theoretically took the Gospel of John apart and put it into pieces would laugh at such methodology. Not the same standards. And I submit to you that truth is defined by consistency. Truth is defined by consistency. If you use scholarship that is serious in examining sources, tries to be fair, but recognizes that we are creatures of God and God has spoken, that's going to be very different than using naturalistic, materialistic scholarship. Now you notice, I didn't quote any of the modern scholars that don't believe Muhammad existed. I could have stood up here and done the same thing he did with his liberal scholars and quoted them and said, oh, well, there you go. If you're a real scholar, you don't believe Muhammad existed, and therefore the Quran is a compilation of many authors. I didn't do that, did I? I can't, because that wouldn't be consistent. That's what we need to be this evening. When Adnan comes up here, if Adnan just simply starts repeating the Uthmanic tradition is it, then I say to you the debate's over. We need to have serious interaction about the methodology that we are using. What I said was, if someone wanted to come along and take the New Testament that didn't teach the deity of Christ and try to insert it, they wouldn't be able to do so because of the distribution of the manuscripts. We can recognize the 7th century hand in Codex Sinaiticus because we know what the 4th century reading was. It was Hos, not Theos. We know that because we have so many manuscripts that are widely dispersed. That's the point. I can't make you hear that. I can't make you understand what I'm saying, but there are people here tonight that do understand what I'm saying. And they're recognizing that my opponent is not understanding it and is not interacting with the sound scholarship that underlies it. And that is a problem. By the way, the difference in Surah 222 that I showed you, not only between the Fogg's palimpsest but the Sa'ana manuscript, is not a pronunciation difference. When you are changing word order and grammatical termination, if you think, oh, well, yeah, that was given in all 7 different forms, are they all around today? Can you all find them? I mean, there's a dispute amongst Muslims on that. You don't even know whether the 7 Aruf are even around anymore. But are you telling me that they actually allow you to have different words in different orders? That makes the variations in the New Testament look really tame. And you just go, oh, but Allah decided to do that. Really? Don't tell me that that's the same text that I showed you up there. It's not. And that's the Sa'ana manuscripts. Then, if I say, if you pray, God will reward you, is that different than if I say, if you pray, God will not reward you? Is there sort of a difference between those two statements? I show you a variant in the Quran with an extra aleph, and you all go, ha, 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 ha. But the difference is between you will be gathered or will not be gathered. That's a 180-degree difference. Laughter is not a refutation, my friends. Laughter is a refutation for the unthinking, not for the thoughtful. Think about that. Did I tell you who Al-Kindi was? I most certainly did. I told you when he lived. He was during the reign of the Caliph Al-Mamun. He was a Christian in dialogue with a Muslim. I told you that. And how many of you wanted to go, Takbir? Because he didn't hear that. You weren't listening very well either, were you? Adnan asked me, why do you want thousands of variants? Because I want to know what the original is, not what someone came up with later on. I don't want thousands of variants. The variants exist because human beings make mistakes in copying. That's why there were mistakes in the Quran as well. Any handwritten document will have mistakes. Do you think God, whenever a scribe was getting tired while making one of the manuscripts of the Quran, he's just about to make a mistake and all of a sudden God just zaps him with caffeine or something? Seriously? There are errors in handwritten manuscripts. That's why you have to have multiples of them to compare with one another. It's not that I want thousands of manuscripts. And notice the complete error in category on Adnan's part here. He says, would you like to write a book? Excuse me, I live today. We don't have to hand copy books anymore. But the fact of the matter is, if I had written a book back then, I'd rather have 7,000 copies of it get to the modern period with variants in it than only one that somebody later on decided to decide what I would actually said. Because at least in the other way, there's a chance the original is there, and the original is in the New Testament. We were told there are thousands of manuscripts of the Quran. In the front of that book, in the back of that book actually, no, not that one, the Greek New Testament, there's a whole listing of the manuscripts that are cited, where they're located, and what date. Could you show me that for the Quran?
The manuscripts?
Yeah. Where's the critical edition of the Quran that tells me which manuscripts are being cited, where they're located, when they're written, and evidently we didn't know who their authors were.
Ali al-Imam has written a book on textual variants in the Quran.
I know he has. Is there an official listing of these thousands of manuscripts that I can go and I can look at for myself? That's what I would like to be able to do. You can do that with the New Testament because we have a critical edition of the New Testament. That's something that's very important. By the way, as I said, the Corpus Chronicum is working on it, and I am glad that they're working on it, but there's a lot of Muslims that don't think that's a good idea and are opposing that. Now, we are told that what Ibn Masud says is exactly what we read today. Really? Well, since there was a lot of clapping and screaming and so on and so forth, I was corrected before, you know. What I had said before, and there are traditions that indicate, and they're primarily from your Shiite brethren, that Ibn Masud died of the beating he received, but you wanted some, I didn't say that tonight. I said that there are traditions that said he was beaten, and as J.C. Vadeh in the Encyclopedia of Islam, Leiden Brill, CD-ROM edition 2004, notes, a public scene ensued between Ibn Masud and the Caliph, who had him ill-treated. Do you know what ill-treated is? Yeah, okay. It is not known whether he died in Medina under a sort of house arrest or at Kufa, where his teaching was highly esteemed. But I will tell you what he said, which seems very odd in light of some of the things that Adnan just said. O you Muslim people, avoid copying the Mus'haf and recitation of this man. By Allah, when I accepted Islam, he was but in the loins of a disbelieving man, meaning Zayd bin Thabit. And it was regarding this that Abdullah bin Masud said, O people of Al-Iraq, keep the Mus'haf that are with you and conceal them. Hide them. Jamiat Tirmidhi, Hadith 3104, if you would like to look it up. Why would he do that if there were not differences, if there was not a reason for him to do that? That is the question, and I am not the only one who has raised that question. That is a question that has been raised by Islamic scholars who are intent not upon simply keeping a tradition alive. Guys, tradition's easy. Tradition's easy. Thinking through your faith and finding solid foundations for it is not easy. And what I've been hearing is whenever Adnan just simply makes an assertion that I've somehow made a mistake, you don't wait to see if there's evidence. It's just like, woohoo! Takbir! See? Thank you. Thank you for proving it. There you go. So, is this the face? Is this the face? Is this the face that you want to present to the world at this time in history, men, when what we should be demonstrating is how Christians and Muslims can control their emotions and examine their traditions and come together as people who believe that they're the creations of God. And by the way, it makes us the minority in our culture these days. And demonstrate we love the truth and that we will examine the truth and that we will do so fairly. This is the time in history when we need to be doing this. I am so thankful that I had the opportunity of debating in the East London Mosque. Folks, when you don't let two groups argue, the only thing left for them to do is fight. We have to engage in this kind of respectful encounter. Now, I know some of you get excited about things. There are people on my side that get excited about things. But folks, this is the foundational issue. If the New Testament is what the New Testament is, then Muhammad didn't understand it, and he didn't teach in accordance with it. And yet the Quran says that God sent down the Torah to Moses, he sent down the Injil to Jesus, and he sent out the Quran to Muhammad. And they all, it's a line. It reads Surah 5 and see it's an argument. This is vitally important, folks. This isn't something to laugh about. This isn't something to let your emotions run wild with you. This is vitally important. And I say to you, I believe I have presented some pretty serious evidence that if you were to use these same scales, use these same standards, I have raised questions for you about the difference between a free transmission of the text and a controlled transmission of the text as to those two methodologies' ability to give you assurance that you're reading what was originally written. I think the thinking person hears that, and you need to deal with that. Simply repeating the same things over and over again that does not interact with those assertions does not accomplish anything for you. Thank you very much.
Okay, James, very quickly. First of all, thank you very much for attending this debate. These topics are vast topics, and it is very difficult to cover everything in this short span of time. But I think we have pretty much presented the most powerful arguments we have up our sleeves. You mentioned a variant reading, and it clearly states, will we go to God or we will not go to God? And you said, you're suggesting that it is a variant reading. However, if you look at other manuscripts, which are, I'm very sure, going to make the picture clear. This clearly appears to be a scribal error. Okay? When we die, where do we go? We go to God. And if the verse is saying, when we die, we don't go to God, then what does logic tell you? Logic tells you, a child will tell you, that this is a scribal error. It is a scribal error. When we look at the other manuscripts of the same verse, time is up. Okay, go ahead.
Let me respond to what Adnan just said. He just engaged in textual criticism. What if you didn't have other manuscripts? What if you were just reading the Paris manuscript, that very early manuscript of the Quran? That assumed a certain understanding of what gathering together means. There, in biblical language, being gathered together to God can be for judgment or for life. So you see, you've now taken your theology and you've taken the other manuscripts and you've done textual criticism, which I thought was why the New Testament was corrupt, because we do the same thing.
Okay,
I'll
James,
stay here,
we don't need any of the manuscripts. We don't need, if we lost all the manuscripts in the world, we still have our oral transmission, which is very, very powerful, and it cannot be doubted for the reasons which cannot be stated in this debate. If you want to have another debate on isnad and its validity, we can talk about that in the future. But if you go to the scholars, Western scholars in this field, they will tell you that isnad is a perfectly valid source of information. Coming to Corpus Quranicum, one of the academics who was working on Corpus Quranicum and the manuscripts in its possession is Michael Marks. Michael Marks is one of the people responsible for this. He stated, after studying all the thousands of pictures of the ancient Qur'ans he has with him, he stated, from the material that has been entered into a database to date, it would appear that any expectations that the old Quranic manuscripts in the old Hijazi script included in the Bergstrasser photo archive would offer a different text of the Quran are unjustified. Comment on that, please.
I'll go a little bit beyond that. I have never, the specific thing, and I sent Adnan my chapter in the book that I've written on the subject of the Quran. It's not out yet, but I sent him the chapter on this. And what did I say in the chapter? I said, what would you expect from a controlled transmission of a text? You'd expect consistency, you'd expect very few textual variants, only what you'd expect to find from handwritten manuscripts, but you would not expect to have much in the way of textual variation. So what that scholar just said is exactly what you'd expect, but it all only goes back to Uthman. That's the point. What about Ibn Masud? What about the Sa'ana palimpsest? If it only goes back to that point of editing, and what Adnan just said, we don't need all those manuscripts. Why then did Sahih al-Bukhari tell us that we were concerned about the people dying at Yamama? Because a large part of the Quran might be what? I read it to you. I didn't make it up. Lost. So yes, you should be concerned about that. Now you have the Uthmanic. That's not the issue. The issue is, does that represent the original?
Why they were concerned was due to non-Muslims or new converts to Islam. This is why, because they were reading the Quran, because they were not Arabs, they didn't know the dialect, they didn't know the differences in Arabic readings and writings. So it was necessary for them, for the Quran to be written for their convenience. So the new converts, they were the ones who caused the problem in the first place. When Hudayfa bin Yaman was in Azerbaijan in a battlefield, and then these new Muslims from Iraq and Egypt, they were reciting the Quran in their own ways, and that's when Hudayfa came back. This problem was never a problem before, the problem of dialect, specifically speaking.
Well, I'm sorry, that's just not what Sahih al-Bukhari says. Where in Sahih al-Bukhari does it say, oh, it's the new converts that are messing everything up? He doesn't say that. And it would not follow that new converts, if the Quran already existed, if it was already written down, if the surahs and ayahs had already been provided by the Prophet himself, there is no reason for the words, we fear that the Quran, a major portion, kathir, a large portion of the Quran might be lost. There is no reason for that. And then there's really no reason for the next hadith that says, well, we don't want to be like the Jews and Christians who differ about our book, and so we're going to do a complete revision, and we're going to find more ayah and put them in there in the process. I'm sorry, but this is a much later construction that does not represent a meaningful reading of those original texts themselves. And when I quoted from Al-Kindi, what I was pointing out was that Al-Kindi has access to the very same traditions that Bukhari has, and from a historical standpoint, that is extremely important. It verifies what Bukhari was saying.
Thank you, James. Bukhari states clearly, Hudayfa bin Yaman came to Uthman at the time when the people of Sham and the people of Iraq were waging war to conquer Armenia and Azerbaijan. Hudayfa was afraid of the people of Sham and Iraq, differences in recitation. So these people, the people of Iraq and Sham, are new Muslims. Okay, so you haven't read the report of Bukhari carefully. As for Uthman, if you have accepted, which you have in front of everyone here, that the Quran can be traced back to Uthman, Allahu Akbar, we're happy with that.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you. That's it. There's the debate.
We're happy with that.
There's the debate. You're happy with that. And you all, hey! I am not. And you know why I'm not? Because I don't want to know what someone revised my scriptures to say. I want to know what they originally said. There's the debate, right there. It's over. It's over. Thank you. That's it, right there. There is the different methodology. One side is happy to repeat a tradition and say, this is our traditional text, we'll hold to it. And the rest of us are saying, that is not enough for issues of universal and final truth. There was the voice of absolute skepticism. He says, how can you reconstruct the text? Adnan, you've never done this. You don't read Greek. You could not use that red book sitting at your right elbow if you tried. If you could open that up, could you read any of that? Could you read any of the textual critical notes? You cannot.
Any of it? Yes, I can.
I guarantee you that Christian scholars, believing Christian scholars, can reconstruct the text. And that's why Kurt Ahland, who founded the Institute for New Testament Studies in Munster, could say the words I said, that the New Testament text has tenacity, which is why we can have confidence that we have the original readings. That was the voice of tradition saying, we have the original, and you don't. How can you know what it looked like? Because we have 5,700 manuscripts that tell us about it. That's how we can know. And they come from all over the world, and they could not have been colluded, and there couldn't be a conspiracy, and scholarship recognizes that's a far better thing to have than to have one text that goes back to one revision. That is the essence of the debate this evening. First of all, thank you very much for staying here this late in the evening. It has been a pleasure here in London once again. We should be thankful that we have the freedom to engage in these types of things. There are many lands where this conversation could never, ever take place. We cannot take it for granted because I'm not sure how long it's going to be allowed in this land or in my land either, to be perfectly honest with you. Adnan just said the New Testament has been lost due to the fact we have no originals. There are no originals of the Quran, therefore the Quran's been lost. If we just apply the same standards. No one, Bart Ehrman does not say that the New Testament has been lost because we don't have originals, and no one who studies historical text makes that assertion. And so Adnan uses one wildly unsubstantiatable standard for the New Testament, and then, boy, we can quote all sorts of scholars who says that we know what Uthman said, as if that means you know what Muhammad said. You just jump there, but be it as it may, we know what Uthman said. So in other words, conservative scholarship of the Quran and naturalistic, materialistic, liberal scholarship of the Bible. I told you it was going to happen, because that's what's happened every time I've had a debate with a Muslim all around the world. And that's the problem. I'm still searching for the consistent Muslim apologist. I'm still searching for that first Muslim who will obey the Quran. Seriously, who will use the same standards. And you see, once you do that, you cannot substantiate what the Quran says about the Bible, because the author of the Quran didn't know the Bible, didn't know what the New Testament taught, and misrepresented what the New Testament taught. We've already debated that issue before. Now, this evening, we've had a lot of talk about original texts. I don't think there's any question whatsoever that any scholar could ever raise to the fact that in Colossians 2:9, the original words that the Apostle Paul wrote, delivered to the church at Colossae, was hati en auto katoikai pan ta pleroma tes theatetas somatikos. I know of no textual variance. That is the text that was written. No one could argue otherwise. You know what those words mean? So we can talk Arabic and we can talk Hebrew. I can guarantee you my Arabic's a whole lot better than his Greek is. but those words were what were written. There's no variation. The manuscripts are more than sufficient on any meaningful basis, any historical basis, to substantiate that that's what Paul said. And you know what those words say to us tonight? Speaking of Jesus Christ, it says, "For in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form." You see, we can have fun talking about these things, and we can get all excited. But you see, what we're really dealing with is eternal truth. And if Jesus Christ is who the New Testament says he is, then he's your maker and he's your creator, and every breath you take and every beat of your heart comes from his hand. And you cannot dismiss him as a mere prophet. And so you see, the issues that we're dealing with are vitally important issues. And my hope is that after the rah and emotion wears off, you will take the time to look at the sources that we've used and the arguments we've used. I'm sure this will be up on YouTube pretty fast. Check it out for yourself and ask yourself the question, who was consistent? Who applied the same standards, both to his text and to the other person's text? Because if you applied different standards, you lost this debate. That is the nature of truth. Inconsistency detects these things. To be truthful is to be consistent. I submit to you that Adnan, as much as I like him, I love his grin, I'd love to have his hair. As much as I like Adnan, he did not use the same standards this evening. And so take the time, consider, and think, because if the New Testament is right, the Jesus it presents is one you need to deal with.